Witch's Sister by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 8. The soft thud of Judith's footsteps sounded behind the curtain. To Lynn, who was barely awake, they seemed miles away, as though she herself were at the bottom of a deep well, far removed from the outside world. She struggled to get her eyes open as she listened to the footsteps going downstairs, and tried to move her arms and legs. Pulling her head up from her pillow, she stared hard at her clock in the darkness. The illuminated hands seemed to blur in front of her eyes. She blinked and stared again. 10 minutes after midnight. She threw her legs over the side of the bed. She was late. Judith and the boy from Cowden's Creek were late. 12:10. The witches were waiting. She groped to the top of the stairs. In the hallway below, she could hear Stevie whimpering. "What is it? I'm sleepy, Judith. I don't want to go." "Stevie!" Lynn screamed, but they had already picked him up and were carrying him down to the first floor. She had to get him before they reached the door. "Stevie, don't go!" she screamed again, stumbling down the stairs and throwing herself at Judith. "Don't go! Help!" Judith whirled around. "Lynn, shut up!" she snapped. "Stop that yelling!" Lynn screamed all the harder. The boy from Cowden's Creek was moving toward the front door. "Help!" Lynn beat her fists against him and grabbed hold of Stevie's leg. "Somebody help!" "We can't go outside with her yelling like this," the boy said to Judith, staring at Lynn. "She's gone mad," Judith hissed. "Absolutely mad." "Lynn, be quiet or you'll have the neighbors over here." "I want the neighbors to come. I want the police to come. You can't take Stevie. Help! Help!" There were hurried footsteps on the stairs, and Mrs. Tuggle in a gray robe, her hair flowing long about a wrinkled face, rushed into the hallway. She grabbed Lynn with such force that her fingers dug deep into Lynn's shoulders. "What on earth?" she scolded angrily. "Who awakened the girl?" "Stevie!" screamed Lynn, finally wrestling him away from Clyde and holding him close to her. "You can't take Stevie. I'll stop all of you. I know all about what you're doing. I'll tell Mother, the neighbors, the police, and..." Mrs. Tuggle clutched Lynn's head between her hands like a steel vise and shook her. "Stop it, girl. Stop it." "I won't!" cried Lynn. "Get Stevie away from her," Judith ordered quickly. "She's crazy. Stevie, come out here on the porch with us." Stevie began to cry and clung harder to Lynn. "I want to go to bed," he wailed. "Don't touch him!" Lynn shrieked again, and Mrs. Tuggle's hands grew even tighter on the sides of her face. "Get the water, Judith," commanded Mrs. Tuggle. "Splash it on her forehead." "No, no water!" Lynn hurled herself away so suddenly that she sent Mrs. Tuggle reeling against the closet door. Then, clutching Stevie in her arms, Lynn rushed into the living room and huddled beside him on the couch. There was silence from the hallway, then a low murmur of voices. Finally, the three of them moved to the door of the living room and stood staring at Lynn. She had broken their spell. Relief flooded through her. She felt exhausted. What would they do now? What would they say? How could they possibly explain it? "She hit me, Mrs. Tuggle," Judith said, sounding shocked. "She came at me, hitting and scratching." "'Twas a bad dream you've had then, Lynn," said the old woman, searching Lynn's face closely. "Best go to bed and sleep it off." "It wasn't a dream," Lynn exploded. "What were you all about, then?" Mrs. Tuggle asked Clyde. "Up in the middle of the night." How well she had rehearsed her lines. "It's the Perseid meteor shower. We wanted Stevie to see it," Clyde explained. "It won't come again for a year." He went out on the front porch. Judith followed. "See, it's beginning." "And for that you're getting a wee child up in the middle of the night?" Mrs. Tuggle scolded. "The idea!" Lynn glared at her through narrowed eyes. "You were giving Stevie to the witches, and you know it," she said deliberately. Stevie began to whimper again. Mrs. Tuggle sat down in a chair opposite the couch and looked at Lynn a long time before she spoke. Her eyes were small and unfriendly. "A bad dream," she said again and shook her head. My. Never in all my life did I see the Morley girls act so. A nightmare, that's what it is." Lynn ignored her. She picked up Stevie and carried him all the way up to her own bed, falling down exhausted beside him. Through the window she could see a patch of dark sky, but no stars, no meteors. Mrs. Tuggle must be furious, she thought, but Lynn was too tired to care. She sank into a fitful sleep. The sun fell full on her face, telling her it was late in the morning. Lynn lay in exactly the same position in which she had gone to sleep the night before, and her left arm ached from being doubled up under her. She rolled over and opened her eyes. Stevie was gone, but she could hear him chattering away somewhere up below. The phone rang. Lynn got up and started downstairs. Then she remembered the boy from Cowden's Creek had put a robe on over her pajamas. Mrs. Tuggle was standing at the foot of the stairs. Then she remembered the boy from Cowden's Creek and put a robe on over her pajamas. Mrs. Tuggle was standing at the foot of the stairs. I thought I heard the phone ring, Lynn said sleepily. 'Twas that Beasley girl again. The third time she's called this morning yet, and she wouldn't believe you were still asleep. She said she's coming over to see for herself. The manners of that girl. What time is it? Almost 11. Clyde's been up since 9. We've had ourselves a chore keeping Stevie quiet so you girls could sleep. She led the way to the kitchen where Stevie was drinking orange juice. Lynn could see the boy from Cowden's Creek reading the comics on the back porch. At least the electricity is on again. I can make a proper breakfast. Judith's still sleeping then? Lynn asked. That she is. After all the commotion last night, that she needs it. Mrs. Tuggle put a plate of scrambled eggs on the table, but Lynn pushed it aside and reached for the cereal box instead. Mrs. Tuggle noticed and shook her head. What a time you girls must give your dear mother. She never told me that you had nightmares. Lynn's jaws tightened. I had no nightmare, Mrs. Tuggle. Well then, let's not talk about it, said the old woman, looking at her curiously. But glad I was to see the light this morning. I'll be wanting bed early tonight. Stevie remembered absolutely nothing of the night before, and when Lynn told him later that the boy from Cowden's Creek had carried him downstairs, he didn't believe it. Lynn had just finished a bowl of wheat checks when Marjorie tapped on the front door and walked in. Boy, am I glad to see you, she breathed, and they went immediately to the window seat in the music room. Mouse had on her Sunday clothes, a pale yellow dress, and white lacy socks. Judith should see her now, Lynn was thinking. She wouldn't believe it was the same girl. What happened? Mouse asked, her eyes popping from their sockets. Tell me everything. Quick, I'm on my way to church. You'll never believe it, Lynn said dryly. Nobody believes it, not even Stevie. Tell me, Mouse begged. Lynn leaned forward. The lights went out in the storm and stayed out all night. Mrs. Tuggle managed that, I'm sure, just to make things easier for them. I put Stevie to bed and tried to stay awake, but I didn't. When I woke up, it was 10 after midnight, and Clyde and Judith were trying to get Stevie out on the front porch. Mouse gasped. I ran down after them and screamed and hollered, and Mrs. Tuggle said I was having a nightmare. She was really mad. So what did she have to say about Clyde and Judith taking Stevie outside? Clyde said he wanted to show Stevie a meteor shower, but I looked out my window and I didn't see a thing. It was obviously what they'd planned to say if anything went wrong. Oh, Lynn, they'll have it in for you now. What do you think they'll try next? They don't have much time if your folks will be home tonight. I don't know. Mrs. Tuggle said that Clyde was supposed to catch the bus from Michigan this afternoon. That was how she was going to explain his disappearance again. See, but I know they'll keep him around till they can murder Stevie some other way. Maybe now your mother will believe you when you tell her what happened. No, she won't. It'll be my word against theirs. Oh, Mouse, what are we going to do? Mouse gave it a moment of concentrated attention. Dig up that grave, she said. What? Dig up the grave of Mrs. Tuggle's brother. It's the only thing left to do. We'll show that there's nobody in it, and then maybe somebody will believe us when we say that Mrs. Tuggles brought him back bodily. Maybe we can even break her spells somehow by opening the grave. Mouse, do you know how long it takes to dig up a coffin? A couple days, maybe? Lynn closed her eyes wearily. When do we start? Tomorrow. I'll call you in the morning. Right now I've got to go to church, and then we're going out to dinner. It's to celebrate my recital, see? How did it go? Awful. I had the hiccups all the way through it, and hit the wrong key each time I hicced, but we're celebrating anyway. Lynn started upstairs again. Mrs. Tuggle said, It's almost noon. Lynn and Clyde will be leaving soon. I thought we'd all get in my car and have a... Mrs. Tuggle said, It's almost noon. Lynn and Clyde will be leaving soon. I thought we'd all get in my car and have us a ride to the bus station to see him off. You'd better wake Judith and tell her to come and have breakfast. She'll be wanting to visit some more with him, I know, before he goes. The old woman was still pretending that he was leaving. Well, Lynn would play along with the game. They'd leave him there at the station, and he'd walk back to Mrs. Tuggle's, where she'd keep him holed up in one of the dark rooms of her house till the time was right, and then they'd try again. Lynn went to her own room, reluctant to face Judith in her fury. It was out in the open now. Both Judith and Mrs. Tuggle knew that Lynn knew but they'd have to fight her tooth and nail to get Stevie. She pulled on her clothes, took a swipe at her hair with the brush, and opened the curtain to Judith's room. Her sister was lying on her side, facing the window, her long, dark hair covering half her face. "Judith?" Lynn said. She stirred but did not answer. "Judith, Mrs. Tuggle says it's time to get up. It's almost noon and Clyde's leaving." Slowly, Judith rolled over and lay with her arms dangling down either side of the bed. "I don't feel so good," she said, and Lynn could scarcely hear her. "I've got an awful sore throat." Lynn stepped over to the bed. "Maybe you got cold last night," she said, and suddenly she gasped. "Judith, you look awful. You've got measles or something." "Measles?" Judith's voice was more like a squeak. She sat up and reached for the mirror. There was a strange rash on her face and arms. Her eyelids were swollen. Her neck looked strangely thick. Judith fell back on the bed and started to cry. Lynn stared, not knowing what to do. Finally, she got a box of tissues from the dresser and set it on the bed. "He's going to see me like this," Judith wailed. "He's going to see me looking awful." "Who?" "Clyde," Judith sobbed. "Oh, I look terrible and I feel miserable." "I'd better get Mrs. Tuggle," Lynn said. She turned and clattered downstairs. Something horrible was happening to Judith. "Is she coming then?" Mrs. Tuggle asked. "She's sick," said Lynn, half suspecting the old woman knew it already. Mrs. Tuggle stared. "Sick, is she? What's the matter with her?" "I don't know, measles or smallpox or something." "Smallpox!" Mrs. Tuggle's hands rose toward the ceiling as though they were pulled by strings, and a moment later she had gathered up her apron in her arms to keep from stepping on it and was dashing up the stairs faster than Lynn had ever seen her move. When they reached the bedroom, Judith was standing in the middle of the floor in her nightgown, staring at herself. The rash was all over her legs, too. There was a strange cast to her skin, as though it were turning yellow. "Oh, Mrs. Tuggle," she sobbed, "I'm sick." "Merciful heavens," Mrs. Tuggle breathed. "Lay you down again, Judith, girl. Lynn, get the thermometer." Lynn raced to the medicine chest and back again. Judith had a temperature of 104 degrees. "If only the Morleys were home," Mrs. Tuggle wailed. "If I had known what would happen here, never would I have come. Listen to me, Judith. I'll be calling the doctor, but you tell me as best you can how you feel." "I hurt all over," Judith wept, "especially my throat. My neck hurts and my stomach hurts, and I've got an awful headache." Mrs. Tuggle hurried down to make the phone call. "Lynn," said Judith weakly, "tell Clyde goodbye for me. Tell him I'm sorry I can't see him before he leaves." "Okay," Lynn said awkwardly. Was she dying then? And give him this," Judith said. She reached under her pillow and pulled out the yellow ribbon that Lynn had seen in the cemetery. "Why?" Lynn asked, curious. "It's important, that's all." Lynn went downstairs, carrying the ribbon. Clyde was standing in the hallway listening to Mrs. Tuggle talking on the phone. "What's the matter with Judith?" he asked Lynn. I don't know. She's awfully sick. She asked me to give you this and says she's sorry she can't see you before you leave." The boy's face flushed. He stuffed the ribbon in his back pocket without a word. Mrs. Tuggle put down the phone. "Fancy that! The doctor won't be home till this evening. Out of town he is. And if it's urgent, I'm to take the girl to the hospital. Now, wouldn't Mrs. Morley like to come home and find her daughter in the hospital?" Stevie heard the commotion and came in from the kitchen. "What's the matter?" "Judith's sick," Lynn answered. "And best you don't go up there bothering her," Mrs. Tuggle told him. She turned to Clyde. "Go back to the house, lad. You'll have to pack up yourself and not be leaving anything behind. I'll call a neighbour friend and have him drive you to the bus." She came forward and kissed the boy on the cheek, giving his arm a pinch. "Do well now in school, and write your granny when there's a moment wanting." "I will," said Clyde uncomfortably. "Thanks for letting me come." "Goodbye, then. You wait for Mr. Simpkins. I'll ask him to come by at 1:30. She picked up the phone again to make her call, and the boy from Cowden's Creek, with his strange blue eyes and maps and books of the stars and heavens, walked out the front door and down the steps. Lynn could see a piece of Judith's yellow ribbon hanging from his pants pocket. It was almost 7 that evening when Mr. and Mrs. Morley returned. Mother took one step in the door, looked at the faces around her, and instantly said, "What happened?" "See," Lynn told herself, "if it weren't for Judith getting sick, I might have run right over to Mother and told her everything about last night. Mrs. Tuggle knew I would. Now everybody's worried about Judith. They won't pay any attention to me. Mrs. Tuggle thinks I'll forget about it, but I won't. It's Judith, Mrs. Morley. It's Judith, Mrs. Morley, Mrs. Tuggle said before Lynn could open her mouth. Lynn marveled at the concerned tone of her voice. What an actress. Where is she? What's wrong? Mother said, dropping her overnight bag on the floor. She's upstairs and very sick. The doctor's been gone all day, but he's on his way now. We'll know something soon, don't you worry. Mrs. Morley's shoes went flying into the living room, and a moment later she was running upstairs in her stocking feet. Father came in carrying another bag. He took one look at Mrs. Tuggle and said, What happened? The second overnight bag dropped on the floor, and Mr. Morley went upstairs. And then the doctor arrived. Lynn sat on the sofa and held Stevie on her lap. What if Judith died? What if the witches were so angry at losing Stevie that they took Judith instead? What if Mrs. Tuggle were giving Judith away just to appease them? 20 minutes later, the doctor and Mr. Morley came back down together and shook hands at the front door. What's wrong with her, Dad? Lynn asked as soon as the doctor was gone. He thinks it's mononucleosis. He took some blood samples and we'll know for sure tomorrow. Thank goodness it doesn't seem to be anything worse, but she's a really sick girl, I'll tell you. It sounds terrible, Lynn ventured. Mr. Morley came over, picked up Stevie, and slung him over his shoulder playfully, giving him a swat on the bottom. She'll feel pretty low for a few weeks, I imagine, but she should be able to start school in September if she takes it easy. She'll need a lot of rest and quiet. You got that, son? Quiet. That means you. Mother came back downstairs with Mrs. Tuggle and collapsed in a chair by the sofa. Stevie jumped on her lap and she cuddled him while she talked. Well, I suppose it could be worse, she said. It's strange, but last night I had a feeling that something was wrong back home. I resisted the impulse to call because I knew you had my number and would call me at the conference if you needed me. It was some time in the night. I just can't remember when. But better to come home to mononucleosis than find the house burned down or the children gone or something. Lynn looked at Mrs. Tuggle. The old woman did not return her glance, but kept her eyes straight ahead. Tell me then, Mrs. Tuggle said, changing the subject. Did you have a good meeting? It was simply marvelous, Mother said. A whole weekend with writers and editors and librarians. They want me to come back again next year for a whole week and teach a full course. I'd love to do it. She did a good job with her lectures, too, Mr. Morley put in. Can take me along any time she wants. That's a fringe benefit of being married to a writer, I guess. How did you all manage other than Judith's getting sick? Mother asked. She looked over at Lynn. Anything exciting happen? Now was her chance. Now with Mrs. Tuggle here, face to face. Mother, came Judith's voice faintly from upstairs. Could I have some aspirin for this headache? Mrs. Morley jumped up. Poor dear. We'll make a bed for her down in the dining room where we can wait on her. Lynn, it looks like you're going to be our nurse for the next couple weeks, doesn't it? There was no time on Monday to dig up the grave. Mother was finishing the last chapter of her book and wanted to get it all down on paper while the ideas were fresh. Later, she would go over it again and again, rewriting it 3 or 4 times before she considered it actually done. She put Lynn in charge of everything, but spent an extra long lunch hour each day, fixing special soups for Judith, and rubbing her back or reading her funny letters and news clippings that she thought would amuse her. Strange, Lynn was thinking one afternoon, but Judith hadn't said one word about the awful night Mother was gone. She had expected a fierce quarrel, but Judith seemed to have no strength to discuss it, or anything else that took a lot of words. Was it possible that Judith didn't even remember it? Was this Mrs. Tuggle's doing? About that grave, Mouse said impatiently Wednesday when she called. I can't this week, Lynn told her. I've got to take care of Judith. I promised I'd read to her this afternoon because her eyes hurt. Wait till she's better. It was a different Judith who lay on the daybed in the dining room, tremblingly eating a bowl of soup, or shuffling slowly to the bathroom and back, scarcely speaking above a whisper. Thank you, she murmured when Lynn picked up something she had dropped or brought her a cool orange drink made in the blender. Mrs. Morley brought a macrame kit, an instruction book, and when Judith began to feel stronger, she and Lynn sat on the daybed, knotting belts and purses from the beige-colored string. All the while they sat together chatting, Lynn studied her sister. Before the events of the summer, Lynn would have described Judith as selfish, arrogant, rude, and cold. She would have said that Judith was that way because she wanted to be. Now she was not so sure whether or not Judith had been possessed. She had always been a different person from Lynn, and would go on all her life being different. There were dozens of reasons why people did what they did. Why some were followers and some were not, for example. The fact was, however, that people could change too. Judith was changing. Lynn herself was beginning to feel different, but she was not sure just how or what it meant. You know, Mouse, Lynn said one day, I think I know what's happened. Judith lost her powers when she got sick. Mrs. Tuggle saw that her plan wouldn't work, and so just gave up on Judith. She made her sick so it wouldn't take our attention. She hoped we'd forget what happened, and I honestly think Judith has, but I won't, not ever. You could be right, Mouse said. Maybe Judith lost her only chance, and Mrs. Tuggle will have to find somebody else, but I think we ought to dig up that grave. 4 days before school began, Judith was feeling very much better. She still took a rest in the middle of the afternoon, but her temperature was down, and she was walking around and even going out some again. She brought her newly made school clothes down from Mrs. Tuggle's, all ready for the new semester. When Lynn went upstairs to take her a letter, she was sweeping her room with a broom and straightening out her dresser. She didn't even grumble at Lynn for coming in without asking. It says CT in the corner, Lynn said, dropping the envelope on the bed. I suppose that's Clyde Tuggle. I suppose, said Judith, and went on with her sweeping. She was going out that afternoon with a new boy she'd met at the library, and there was no time for letter reading now. Lynn noticed that the ring she had been wearing on her finger for several weeks was gone. Stevie had been invited to go to the park with some neighbors, so Lynn and Marjorie had the afternoon to themselves. It was somewhat cooler than usual. The air had a crispness about it that spoke of fall and school and change, and soon vacation would be over. It was a day for just remembering and feeling and being, and doing nothing in particular. The girls sat on the front porch, looking out over the September haze that seemed to envelop the street. What do you think she's doing now? Mouse asked. Who? Mrs. Tuggle. Probably sitting up in her window with a spyglass, looking around for a new girl, said Lynn. Both were silent for a moment. Boy, I'll bet she's really got it in for you, Mouse said finally. If it weren't for you, think of the power she'd have. You'll never want to visit her again, will you? Lynn shifted uneasily. It's strange, but I feel I will somehow. Lynn! I know, it doesn't make sense. Maybe it's curiosity, I'm not sure. But I have this weird feeling that I've got to find out the whys of Mrs. Tuggle. In fact, I'd like to go up there right now and see if she hasn't got Clyde hidden away in one of those rooms. Lynn, you don't know what you're saying. Don't you feel a sort of pull when you think of Mrs. Tuggle's house? No, I feel a push. Backwards. I wouldn't go there again for $1 million. Lynn stood up. How about 50 cents? I'll give you a Kennedy $50 if you'll go up to her house with me and ask to use the bathroom. How many times can we ask to use her bathroom without making her suspicious? Mouse croaked. Well, we'll say that Judith thinks she left some of her clothes, then ask to go up to the sewing room and check. She'll follow us upstairs. At least we can look around and listen for footsteps. If Clyde's there, we might find a clue. Okay, 50 cents, sighed Mouse, and they went down to the street below and started up the steep hill. Lynn was quiet as they walked along. She had never told her mother what had happened that night. She was tired of telling and not being believed. If Mrs. Tuggle's claim on Judith was released by her illness, Lynn would never bring up the subject again. But if Judith began going back to Mrs. Tuggle's, or other things began happening that no one could explain, Lynn would tell her everything. Think the witches will come and carry her off? Mouse said at last, breaking the silence. Who? Mrs. Tuggle. Maybe they're so mad at losing Stevie and then Judith that they'll take her instead. It wouldn't work. She doesn't have enough fat or anything. That's something I always wondered about, Lynn. What do you suppose they do with it anyway, all the fat? It doesn't take that much to grease a broomstick. Make candles out of it, I suppose, to dance around at midnight. Maybe we should just ask her right out. Mrs. Tuggle, what do you witches do with all that fat? At first, they thought she wasn't home. Lynn knocked, and then after a minute, Mouse rapped loudly with the ghoulish-looking knocker. They were turning away to peep in the window when the door opened slowly, creaking as though it were blown open by the wind, and in the darkness of the inner hallway they could see the old woman's eyes glistening from her small wrinkled face. Come in, she said, and smiled as soon as she saw Lynn. I was expecting you. You were? Asked Lynn in a whisper. Mrs. Tuggle led the way into the kitchen. I have been counting peaches all week, and your mother said she'd send you up sometime to get a few jars. Make a good cobbler they will come winter. The girl still needed an excuse to go upstairs and look around. Judith wasn't sure she got all her clothes from the sewing room, Lynn said. I told her we'd come up and check. The old woman turned around and looked at the girls intently. Then she smiled knowingly, and her gold tooth glinted in the light. Of course, do go look. Lynn and Mouse moved quietly up the stairs from below. Mrs. Tuggle began her strange crooning. This may be our last chance to look around, Lynn whispered. If you see anything at all suspicious, remember it. They were almost at the top of the stairs when they heard the footsteps. They were not overhead this time, but on the very floor where the girls were standing. The bathroom door was closed, and there was a sound of running water in the basin. Lynn and Marjorie flattened themselves against the wall in the upper hallway, fingers digging in one another's arms. What will we say when he comes out? Mouse whispered. Boo? I don't know. What if it's not Clyde? What if it's somebody else she's conjured up? Mrs. Elfreda Lewis or somebody? The water stopped, and there were footsteps again. The bathroom door opened, and a shadow fell on the wall outside. A tall shadow, taller than Clyde. And suddenly, Mrs. Morley stepped out into the hall. Lynn, what in the world are you girls doing up here? We came to see if Judith left any clothes, Lynn stammered. Well, I'm glad you're here because dear Mrs. Tuggle has been canning peaches and wants to give us some. You can help me carry them home. Lynn's mother looked radiant. Guess what? I finished the first draft of my book, and I'm giving myself the afternoon off. She put one arm around each girl and walked back downstairs with them. Oh, I feel glorious. I finished the book and I'm free, free, free. Mother always said she was free when she finished a book, even though she'd spend the next 2 months rewriting it. It's not perfect yet by any means, she continued excitedly, but I just know it's going to be a good one, really. They picked up the peaches in the kitchen, 2 jars apiece, and Mrs. Morley thanked Mrs. Tuggle again. They went back out through the big front door, which closed slowly behind them, but not all the way, and the old woman watched them through the crack with small, beady eyes. It's a different kind of book this time, Mrs. Morley began as they started down the brick sidewalk, Lynn on one side of her, Mouse on the other. You see, it starts out with... Mouse liked a good story and was a willing listener, but Lynn knew better. Mrs. Morley would talk on and on. We were just on our way somewhere, Mother, she said. I mean, we've got things to do. Maybe you could tell us about the book some other time? What were you going to do? Asked Mother. Well, dig up a grave, maybe. Lynn said desperately. Ah, you see, you're responsible for my story, you two. That's why I want you to be the first to hear it. You see, in the beginning, Anne Bridges suspects that her sister Elsie is a witch, and all kinds of things happen. I can't begin to tell you everything. Lynn and Marjorie turned slowly toward each other, their eyes wide, but Mrs. Morley moved on down the brick sidewalk, bobbing and swaying. And there's an old woman in the book. Of course, it's really Mrs. Tuggle, whom Anne believes is responsible for putting a hex on her sister. Somehow Anne gets the idea that the old woman is going to set fire to the house. There's just so much. The plot is all woven up in witchcraft and superstition. Don't you think it will be marvelous? I don't know, Mouse stammered. But then at the very end, guess what happens? Mother rattled on, as though the girls weren't even there. They had reached the Morley house and had gone into the kitchen to put the peaches on the table. Mother lowered her voice to a whisper. At the very end, in a horribly scary scene, with the old woman and Anne alone together, their 2 shadows mingling in the light of a candle, Anne discovers that it is not really Elsie after all who is becoming a witch, but she herself. And when she looks in the mirror, she sees instead the face of the old woman. Like the 2 lidless angels in the cemetery, Lynn and Mouse stood like chunks of marble, neither moving nor speaking, their eyes unblinking, their lips wide open. The horror settled slowly down upon them, like the September haze rolling in from Cowden's Creek, but Mrs. Morley didn't even notice. I'm going to bake a pie and celebrate, she said, stepping out from her sandals and padding barefoot about the kitchen. Thanks for helping me with the peaches, girls. It's a glorious afternoon, isn't it? Slowly, Lynn and Marjorie moved out of the kitchen, through the door and down the sidewalk to the steep steps, where they sat together side by side, linked in a common trance. A shadow fell over the street, over the old brick sidewalks, and the gabled houses. Somewhere from the sky over Cowden's Creek a crow called, then another, and the girls turned their faces toward the house on the hill where an old woman waited. And that's the end of Witch's Sister. Very fun book. There are several sequels to it. If you request the sequel after watching this video in real time, I might have time to do another one in October. Otherwise, if you make the request for sequels, it probably will not happen until next October, but don't worry, there is John Bellairs on the way. Really fun book. I am curious to find out if anything actually supernatural happens in the sequels, so I am just as excited as you potentially are to hear more. But just let me know if that's what you're looking for, and I will see you in the next read aloud.